My name is Sam Nuzio. I am your on-site well-being coordinator with EHE. I'm also a registered dietitian, so I'm actually going to be giving today's presentation on Thanksgiving menu planning, which is one of my favorite things to talk about because the holidays can be super tricky. So I'm really excited to dive into that today. And then I'm also actually going to be doing next week's presentation. I usually do a cooking demonstration for my Let's Talk Wellnesses. So today we're doing a presentation. Next week we're gonna do a Thanksgiving leftovers recipe. So I'll be sure to share with you guys what we're making at the end of the presentation today. All right, so we're gonna dive into Thanksgiving menu planning. And before we get started and jump into the content, I'd love to hear if you guys have some traditional holiday recipes that you guys usually have. What's your favorite Thanksgiving food? For me, my family is very Italian. And we had baked ziti every year growing up. My grandma made the sauce all day. It was one of our favorite family things is she'd start early in the morning. And then you guys know that's how to make the sauce, right? So it would be delicious. But that was always a family tradition that was really special to me. Does anybody have a favorite Thanksgiving food? You could feel free to come off mute or put anything into the chat. See, we've got some chats. Ham, stuffing, and sausage. Yum. Great. Okay.
I like the candied yams.
Candied yams. Yes, Holly.
Love them. I know they're bad, but I love them.
That's okay. No bad foods, right? No bad foods, especially on a holiday. Does anybody else want to share? We got some more in the chat. Let's see. Stuffing. Jen was born on Thanksgiving. How cool is that? Mashed potatoes, everything. Yes, I love it. So just so you guys know, I'm going to keep the chat up. So if you want to send anything directly to me, wait till I do so and close it up. Pecan pie. Yes. Oh, stuffing is such a staple, such a mainstay. I love, love, love it. And stuffing is actually going to be part of our recipe next week. So I'm really excited to have that as well. Okay, so some things that you want to think about when you're menu planning are how many people are coming for your holiday celebration. So of course that would dictate how much we're going to make, right? And then often we also have leftovers as well. Food allergies. Now I know that households that have food allergies know this through and through, but if you do have someone coming over or you're going somewhere where there is a food allergy prevalent, it is really something to pay attention to. Sometimes like cross-contamination happens very easily and people are sensitive to different levels of allergen. So just to be mindful of that, if that's something you have to think about. And then offering a balanced, delicious menu. And the word balance, I think, is really tricky sometimes because we see balance and we think, okay, means I got to get all my food groups. And yes, it does. We just want to offer a variety of foods, and especially on a holiday. I always say one meal doesn't make or break a wellness journey. One meal, one holiday. But I'm going to also give you guys some tips at the end for how to have a healthier holiday as well, just some behaviors to think about the day of. Okay, so let's dive into menu planning. So I am going to put, I'm going to actually go through my plate. So for those of you who are not familiar, my plate is via the USDA. It actually used to be the food pyramid. It's now a plate. Back in the day, and I'll allude to this a little bit more later in the presentation, but I was a retail dietitian, so I worked in a supermarket, and this is how I would teach kids and adults, just fun ways to make sure we're incorporating different food groups. So what I'd like to do first is just kind of go through what types of foods are in each food group. Some of them are intuitive, but we'll go through this pretty quickly. So when we talk about grains is that orange section on the plate. It's going to include stuffing, biscuits, bread, pasta, those types of foods on your Thanksgiving plate. And I'm here to tell you not to be afraid of carbohydrates. They are so important. Grains are okay, especially on a holiday. So being mindful, I always say, of how we're loading up our plates is really important. So thinking about which foods you'd really like to enjoy, if it's all of them, maybe you take small servings to start and then, wait and see if you'd like to go for seconds. But grains are really important. We're going to talk about some whole grain examples when we talk about the shopping piece. But, whole grains means that there's all three parts of the grain when we look at refined or white grains. So like white bread, white rice, those types of things. they have 2 of those parts removed. So there's 3 parts. There's a germ, which is the little germ inside the endosperm, and that has really great nutrients. That's taken away. And the bran, which everybody thinks of bran as fiber. I'm doing this because it's the outer shell. That's always what I've done, germ and bran. But the bran is the fiber. It's also got good nutrients as well. So a lot of times we see that is taken away in refined grains. So when we look for whole grains, that's really the difference, is we're getting a lot of different nutrients as they're naturally occurring in the food, as well as fiber content, which is really great. And we know that helps with fullness, and among many other benefits of fiber. So where you can find whole grains is great. If there are no whole grains in your holiday, that is okay. That is absolutely okay. But I'll give you guys some fun examples of a couple of things I made back when I was in the supermarket. There were a lot of fun recipes we used to do. Moving on to vegetables. Vegetables are, we all know intuitively what vegetables are. Really easy. I just threw a couple up there that are pretty common for the holidays. I saw mashed potatoes come through as some people's favorites. I saw sweet potatoes, the candied yams come through. So those are really important. The reason why I have the star next to some of these is because these are more carbohydrate rich. So when we look at sweet potatoes, we look at mashed potatoes, butternut squash or butternut squash soup, roasted acorn squash, those types of things are going to add more carbohydrates in addition to the carbohydrates we have as on the grain section on our plate. That doesn't mean you can't have the stuffing and the mashed potatoes or the stuffing and the sweet potatoes. It's just thinking about the right portion size, or not even the right portion size, but the right portion size for you. So maybe it's having smaller portions of these 2 things. And again, checking in and seeing how you're feeling throughout the meal. Because sometimes with Thanksgiving, especially on Thanksgiving, I almost feel like it's the running joke of Thanksgiving also, is we tend to eat a lot more than we usually do. And a lot of times we tend to eat quickly. And when we start to slow down, and I'll give more tips on this later, but when we slow down, we give our body time to realize that we're full. So it really does help to, engage in conversation around the dinner table, all of those types of things in order to slow down the meal. Make sure you're really chewing your food. Because, sometimes we can just, we go out to dinner sometimes and the food is brought to the table and we notice that everybody's quiet and everybody's just eating. So if you notice yourself doing that, just take a couple of seconds, maybe put the fork down. And this fullness really helps us to kind of pay attention to how we're going to feel after we have the meal. Plus, we know there's some delicious desserts coming on Thanksgiving, usually, right? Something pumpkin based for me always. So just being mindful of those other carbohydrate-rich vegetables in addition to the grains that we might have on our plate as well. So we talk about protein. I mean, of course, the big one is turkey, right? So there are turkey, ham, and I put tofu on here for people that may follow a vegetarian or vegan diet. I know sometimes that is utilized on this holiday as well in a couple of different forms. I'm going to talk a little bit about purchasing your turkey and your ham, but protein is definitely prevalent on the Thanksgiving plate. And I will say, if you're, you notice you have some rules around eating maybe only the chicken breast, or, it's okay to have some of the dark meat. We know that the dark meat does have saturated fat, so it's going to be a little higher in saturated fat, but maybe having smaller amounts of those if it's something you like, and then a piece of the breast. And just a fun fact for protein, the recommended portion is usually about the size of your palm. But again, I like to tell people to try to go by fullness and balancing out a plate a little bit based on your preferences. Okay, fruit. I had a tough time thinking about fruit for the holidays. I came up with a couple. Of course, cranberries. So cranberries are technically berries. They are fruit, even though they are not very sweet. But when we think about the canned cranberries, those are going to have a decent amount of sugar added to them. So those are going to be pretty sweet. So just something to think about. Fresh cranberries can be utilized in different recipes other than just having for the canned product on the table. You can do fresh cranberry sauce. I really love this time of year, especially to roast butternut squash cubes, with cranberries, add a little bit of maple syrup and cinnamon, just to give it a lot of that fall flavor. So cranberries are really great. And then the other thing I wanted to mention about cranberries, when we talk about like dried cranberries, so whether it's craisins or a different brand, those are very sweet usually. So what I always tell people to do is you don't need a lot of them to give that sweet flavor, whether it's in a salad, whatever the case may be. But any time that you're using those, if you can chop them up, and I know they're sticky, but if you can chop them up, that gives you more surface area and you can disperse the same amount of craisins or dried cranberries into a salad. So you're using the same amount, but you're getting more surface area. So you're getting more flavor. And that way, when you do get it in one of your bites, it doesn't overpower it with sweetness either. So just something to think about. It's a little tip that I picked up a couple of years ago that I really like to share with everyone. And then of course, oranges, applesauce, these are depending on what type of protein you might be choosing, might also accompany your meal as well. And then of course, dairy. Dairy comes in more of like the toppings or maybe part of sauces. So we have cheese, milk, yogurt. Those are really going to be our main dairy foods that are prevalent on the Thanksgiving plate, but within recipes usually. So with that, I'm going to take our next step into just tips to help limit the holiday stress of holiday meal prep. So planning the menu ahead of time. So taking into consideration those first 4 things we talked about, how many people are coming, if there are any food allergies or food preferences that you want to kind of look at. Recipe search for inspiration. Now I put a star next to this one because I did want to make sure that we are still honoring our culture and our traditional family recipes, but there are some really cool recipes out there nowadays. And something I usually like to say, a good place for these might be like a Friendsgiving, as long as we're gathering safely, right? But if maybe it's not your holiday menu, but or it's a meal prep. Maybe you're feeling you'd like to have some of those fall flavors, and using some of these different recipes that maybe have quinoa or farro in them, that might not make it onto your Thanksgiving table. They could, but it might not make it on there. At least you have it during the season. I like using the flavors of fall. I think it makes a big difference. And I always say, don't make multiple dishes of the same food. This is something my mom used to do because my sister was a very picky eater, I recall. So she used to make like 3 different versions of the sweet potatoes. And as we grew up, I'm like, Mom, if it's easy for you, just bake them and we can candy them ourselves. So that's fun. We kind of do a sweet potato bar as part of it, right? So you can make them sweet, you can make them savory. So that's a really fun thing that we started doing at our Thanksgiving as well. So ways that you can be creative and innovative in using maybe similar ingredients when you have different preferences around the table. So you're not making 3 different dishes using the main feature of a sweet potato or whatever the case is. So I know that this is probably the time of year that everybody is creating a shopping list, but I am huge on shopping lists for multiple reasons. First being, I always stress myself out when I leave the store and I forget a main ingredient for a recipe. So creating shopping lists throughout the year can be really important, but breaking it down by department, that's what I always have people do, breaking it down by each recipe that you might be using. So whether you're pulling out a family member's recipe book, or maybe you've got some printed online for what you'd like to make for your Thanksgiving this year, have those handy when you're creating the shopping list. That way you're not thinking, oh, what did that recipe call for? And I know it seems intuitive, but I've got caught doing this and I forgot an ingredient. So definitely something to think about, just to make it a little bit more organized. I always like to organize it by department, and also like time from, which we're going to get into the next slide, but time from when I'm going to be making the recipe, because that will actually help to limit food waste as well, and ultimately help to be more economically savvy in our food shopping, right? Because nobody wants to throw anything away. And then best time to buy, which I have there. Purchase items ahead of time where appropriate. We're going to talk about that. And maybe if you're having people over, you're hosting, maybe asking people to make a dish to fill the table. So that way all the cooking isn't on you. So that's another thing to think about as well. And I love this one. It's one of my favorites. The last one here, consider purchasing easier prep items. So my mind, I'm hooked on butternut squash today. I'm going to go back to that example, but I cannot cut a butternut squash open. Like I've tried all the tricks, but I just can't do it. So for me, buying the cubes makes it so much easier in order to roast, or if I'm going to make soup, like that is something that just makes my life easier. So I definitely go that way for things that I have difficulty cutting open, or maybe we're going to talk about timing in a minute, but maybe something I don't eat as often, don't feel as comfortable cutting up or prepping. Like it's nice when it's already done. Okay. Next, so I just had a couple of examples here. If you guys have other examples you want to throw in the chat, please feel free. But a couple of things that you can consider buying 1 to 2 weeks before. So of course your stuffing base, I saw them out this weekend, which is crazy. Again, I keep thinking Thanksgiving so far away, but it's not. So the bread cubes, if you're buying them in the bag like that, if you're using rice, I actually have made a quinoa based stuffing in the past, which is really fun. That was a Friendsgiving recipe. It didn't make it to my Thanksgiving table, but maybe it will this year. And what I love, I know someone wrote a sausage stuffing. If for any reason you didn't want to add the sausage, but the sausage is also going to add some protein. If for any reason you don't want to add the sausage, I like to grind up fennel seed and add that. The fennel seed really almost gives it like a sausagey flavor. And I really love adding mushrooms to it because I think it has good texture. So just a little tip, something that I've tried and went over really well when I did make it. And then for those of you that aren't familiar, I know quinoa has gone pretty mainstream now, but farro, that's another whole grain. So remembering that these are higher in fiber. So I always tell people to go slower with these. If it is something that you wanted to try during this time of year. Farro is very filling. It does have some protein. I almost say it's almost, the texture is chewy, but it's in a good way. I know chewy doesn't sound like a good texture, but I would definitely say it's chewy in a good way. And then, looking at if part of your recipes are buying stock or broth. I left my broth in the kitchen. I was going to show you guys, but look for lower sodium, just because salt comes in everywhere in this holiday, or in really every holiday, right? Because we have so many different foods that we're incorporating. So if you're choosing a stock or broth, a lower sodium one is a great place just to be able to limit the salt that you're adding in just from that one item. So just a quick fact, the one that I had actually was low sodium, but it didn't say it on the label. So if you look at the nutrition facts label, it has percentages on the side. So if you see sodium 5% or less, that's considered a low sodium item for the serving size. So that's just a really quick fact that you could say, oh, this is a lower sodium product. So that's a really easy food shopping tip. So that's always a really great way to save on the sodium. Sauces as well. You can definitely purchase those. I talk about sauce, right? We do sauce in my house for Thanksgiving. So that's why I have that on there. But that's another thing too, where you could look at maybe added sugars is on the label now. So you could look at added sugars and sodium there. Canned cranberries, which I know have been out for a while now. Cheese, of course, something you could always get. Oil, butter, if you don't already have it on hand. And then a lot of times I will say, if you're cooking with salt or butter or oil, sometimes you don't need the full amount. And especially with salt, once it's cooked and you taste it, that's always something you could add later. So if you can kind of like ease up a little bit on the recipe, the salt that's in the recipe, that actually might help you to, again, save on some salt intake. And that way it gives you a little bit more leeway, and maybe you're eating a little less sodium than you would have. Of course, other shelf-stable items and baking supplies, if you're baking desserts, flours, canned pumpkin is a really fun one, especially just talking about recipes this time of year. Adding it to cookies and that type of stuff really helps to keep things moist. So there are definitely a ton of recipes out there around that. So canned pumpkin is really fun. And then one baking tip I have for flour, if you're ever using whole wheat, is I always sift it, because if you get the air like in between, it's very dense. So if you're making sure that you're getting the air like well incorporated with it, it tends to bake up a little nicer. And then using half whole wheat, half white is usually recommended. So that's just something I've also learned over my time baking with whole wheat flour. And remember, whole wheat is going to be those whole grains. It's going to have those three pieces of the whole grain I told you about, the bran, the germ, and then the endosperm, which is the starchy carbohydrate center, which I forgot to mention. That's always a part of grains, whole wheat or white. And then the frozen items, of course. I mean, anytime we can get frozen items. So there may be some things that you might add to your table. This year, we're actually doing Brussels sprouts in the air fryer, which I'm really excited about. So if there's something you can't get fresh, there's also another way to go with frozen vegetables if you need to. So it's just something else to think about as well. And then, so 3 to 5 days before. Now I know I put a star next to the turkey and the ham. Of course, we know that a lot of supermarkets give these foods away. Well, not away, but you spend so much during the holiday season, a lot of times you're eligible for a free food item. So definitely check out your supermarket to see if they do have that, because it's a great thing to take advantage of. I just wanted to say a couple of things about the turkey and the ham. When you're buying it, of course, fresh, if you're buying fresh, you want to get it a couple of days before, 1 to 2 days before. Frozen, depending on the size, you will have to consider defrosting time. And one thing I really want to say is making sure that we're not defrosting out on the counter. That is something for food safety we want to avoid doing. So I always recommend, even if you just Google how to defrost your Thanksgiving turkey and make sure it's an FDA website, they will give you instructions on how to do that safely. So just something to think about. I always bring that up this time of year. Fresh vegetables, herbs, and fruit. I mean, this is the time of year where everybody's buying herbs, poultry, herbs, all those types of foods. So definitely make sure you try to get your hands on them. The tricky piece is it's busy. Everybody's looking for the same things. So, if you have to resort to a dried spice or a dried herb that you might have used fresh, it's still going to offer great flavor. So it's okay if you have to go the dried route as well. And then lastly, I just wanted to talk for a couple minutes about these habits for the day of. So of course, we know that planning might help ease some holiday stress. Eating a breakfast and lunch based on your hunger is so important, because so many times I've heard people say, oh, I'm going to save calories for Thanksgiving. I'm going to save calories for dinner. I'm not going to eat breakfast or lunch. But what happens? You might not feel good all day. By the time you get to dinner, you might be so hungry that you end up eating even more than you would have if you had had breakfast and lunch. So I never like to say you have to eat breakfast and lunch, but focus on your hunger and fullness. If you're hungry for lunch, have something. If you're hungry for breakfast, have something, but don't avoid meals or snacks because dinner's coming. And also I think too, what happens sometimes with cooking, we end up kind of grazing or picking at the food as we're cooking it, depending on what you're making. And a lot of times that adds up and might contribute to fullness right before dinner. So just something else to think about as well. Not to say don't have appetizers, have some delicious appetizers around, but it's just something to think about when I always call it grazing. I attribute to being almost like mindless eating. So we're not really paying attention. And then you're like, oh, why am I full? And then you realize maybe what you ate in the previous hour or so. And then I always say, if you can incorporate some movement that makes you feel good the day of, that's great. Sometimes we're in the kitchen running around all day and we don't have time to do that. But, if you're going to, maybe there's a 20-minute yoga video you'd like to do, or maybe you go for a walk with your family and that's part of your tradition, whatever the case is, any movement that makes you feel good. Maybe you're dancing in your kitchen with your family. That's another fun thing. Eat slow and enjoy the company of friends and family. That kind of goes into what I was saying about just kind of like taking a moment to slow down. Really important. And then I always like to think about before filling your plate with dinner or dessert, a lot of times, and this is something I used to do, I would just start. I would go in, grab a little bit of everything, go back for seconds, and wouldn't really think about what looked so good to me that I really wanted to enjoy. So I always tell people to take a look at what's available and what's really calling out to you. What do you actually want to eat? And it's okay if you don't want to eat the turkey, or it's okay if you don't want to eat the pasta, but really pick the foods that you're going to enjoy and that are really kind of calling out to you, because that's going to help with satisfaction. And then check in during your meal and dessert, see if you're starting to feel full. If you know dessert's coming and you say, oh, I'm really starting to feel full, maybe you take 1 or 2 bites more and that's it. Knowing that the leftovers are likely going to be available to you for the next few days. And this last one is one of my favorites. I know that Jen does this a lot in the will sessions as part of it, but really offering gratitude. I know we talk about doing that on Thanksgiving a lot, but it just can alter mindset so much. So, sometimes things get a little stressful around the family table, but taking a moment to really center back, and it doesn't have to be at dinner, but at some point during the day, maybe just take a couple of minutes and think about what you are grateful for, because it can really help just with mindset and mood and that type of stuff. Okay, and next week we are going to make shepherd's pie with a few very specific ingredients that are very common Thanksgiving leftovers. So I'm really excited. It's going to be a really fun one, and I hope you guys can join. So how are we doing on time? 3 minutes. Look at that. That's awesome. So we made it. Thank you guys so much for participating. If you guys have any questions, thoughts, feedback, I'm going to be in the chat for the next 5 minutes or so. So please feel free to leave any comments or feedback that you have. I'm blocking part of the code here with the chat. So Jen had provided me with your Virgin Pulse voucher code. So you get 100 BeWell points for today for attending. So the voucher code, I'll read it out for those of you that might be on the phone, is 63EG-B4AA-5N. I don't think you need the dashes, right, Jen? I just read it out exactly as it was written.
Yep, no dashes needed.
No dashes. Okay. Well, if anybody has questions, thoughts, want to share anything else about their Thanksgiving traditions, please leave them in the chat. Come off mute. We'll be here for a couple more minutes. Thank you guys so much. Thanks, Jen.
No problem. That was great. Making me hungry, like always.
I know. I always get hungry when I have to talk about food. But cooking, I think, is worse though, right? Because then the smells. I'm talking to everyone. Sure. So let me give the voucher out again. It's 63EG-B4AA-5N. Yeah, sweet potato bar, so fun. I even love that for like a random dinner night. Like if you have leftover rotisserie chicken, shredding that and putting that in and almost making like taco style sweet potatoes is really fun. There's so much you can do with that. Yeah, thank you guys so much for coming.
Awesome, Sam. All righty, guys. Have a great day. If you guys have any questions, please let us know. Thank you.
All right, see you next week.
See you next week.